On the day the two deer hunters were killed on the game area that bordered Jeff Titus's farm, Jeff Titus hadn't been at home. Instead, he'd been 27 miles north, hunting at a farm owned by Gerald and Eloise Shepard. In 1990, shortly after the murders, the Shepards had spoken to the case's original investigators, and they'd confirmed they'd seen him there. To the original investigators, this evidence exonerated Jeff Titus, and they disagree with the decision of the cold case team 10 years later to disregard it.
The travesty is that Jeff had an alibi, but they had blinders on. It seems that they just put the blinders on and go right for him. Even after it's obvious he had an alibi as to where he was.
But the Shepards weren't the only ones who were with Jeff Titus that day. Jeff hadn't been hunting alone. He had been with a friend, and the two of them had been together from before dawn until after dusk that day.
My name is Stan Driscoll, and I was a hunting companion of Jeff Titus for 20 years.
Like the Shepards, Stan Driscoll had been able to confirm Jeff's alibi. Stan assured investigators that there was no way Jeff could have committed the murders. But in his interview with the cold case detectives, Stan admitted to something that would eventually become the foundation of the prosecution's case against Jeff Titus.
Oh, where I admitted that he was not with me every hour of the day. That's nothing, because we never were all together all the time.
Stan and Jeff had been hunting together that day, but hunting together isn't like, say, playing chess together or having dinner together or going to the movies together. It's a more distant kind of together.
The cold case detectives, they see that as a window of opportunity, and they seize upon that. They see it as blowing up his alibi. Well, it doesn't, because that is normal behavior. I would guess any deer hunter. Two people do not sit in a blind together hunting deer.
Jeff Titus was in one blind, and his alibi witness was in another, where they were hidden from the deer, but also from each other. And to the cold case team, this meant that Jeff Titus didn't have an alibi witness at all.
Hi and welcome to Undisclosed. This is episode 5 of The State versus Jeff Titus. My name is Rabia Chaudhry. I'm an attorney and author of the New York Times bestseller, Ep9 Story. And I'm here with my colleagues, Susan Simpson and Colin Miller.
Hi, this is Susan Simpson. I'm an attorney in Washington, D.C., and I blog at The View from LL2.
Hi, this is Colin Miller. I'm an associate dean and professor at the University of South Carolina School of Law, and I blog at Evidence Prof Blog.
You can say I was born in a cornfield in Iowa, went to Illinois Institute of Technology and did a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering too many years ago. Went to University of California, did a couple of degrees in economics. Went to Africa for 7 years, lived in 3 different areas where I taught and did research. Came back to the U.S. for a couple of years. Went to East Asia for 7 more years. Oh, I forgot that I spent a year in England after I left Africa. Spent some years in South Korea, Philippines, and Thailand. Came back home, went back to university at age 46 or something, did a second doctorate.
In many ways, Jeff Titus and Stan Driscoll were from different worlds. And at least on paper, you probably wouldn't pick the two of them out as being friends. But after they met in the late 1970s at the local community college where Jeff had been taking classes, he and Stan had quickly become friends.
I met him at KCC. I was up there taking classes, and one day the guy that runs the computer section, Larry Straits, he overheard us talking, and we got introduced. And then the next thing we know, we started talking about shooting woodchucks and stuff like that. And he'd been hunting in Africa and stuff like that. And so we kind of hit along.
And you guys became hunting partners and friends?
Right. Yep. We would go deer hunting together. He would go squirrel hunting, rabbit hunting.
Jeff and Stan were hunting partners for over 2 decades. They'd go out and hunt for whatever game was in season, but it was deer hunting that was Jeff Titus's true love. And although Stan himself had been an experienced hunter when he and Jeff first met, he'd been less familiar with hunting white-tailed deer. It was Jeff who had taken him out and shown him the ropes.
He's exceedingly visually active. He sees any little clue. He knows intensely the behavior of deer and how they function at different times of day, and it makes him a master hunter.
So he, when you guys went hunting, he usually came away with a deer?
Oh, good grief! That's deer are not easy to find. No, usually not. I mean, you can spend several times before you have a chance to get a deer. If you hunt every day during the 2 weeks of hunting season in Michigan, firearm season in Michigan, most people wouldn't get a deer. Jeff would probably get 2, maybe 3, typically.
Wow, so he was really good.
He was very good.
Every year when deer season came around, Jeff would try to take the whole week off, and most years Stan would drive down from his home in Ann Arbor to join him for part of it. Jeff had friends who'd let them hunt on their property, so when Stan and Jeff first met, that's usually where they go hunt. But then in 1990, Jeff bought his own property. It had 80 acres of fields and forest, and although the farmhouse had been a little run down, he'd gotten to work making repairs. The Titus family had moved in late that summer, and just a few months later, on November 15th, was the start of Jeff's first gun hunting season on his new farm, though things got off to a slow start.
And we really didn't see nothing the first 2 days. We didn't have no deer then. Other years, we turned around and got our deer the first day, second day, and right on through. But the first year, we didn't really have any luck till later in the season.
We've spoken to hunters and neighbors who knew Jeff Titus and who had seen him out there hunting in Fulton on both the 15th and 16th of that year. So there's no doubt he was there the first 2 days of deer season. Although there's no record of any conflicts occurring on Jeff's land during those first 2 days, another nearby landowner wasn't so lucky.
That would have been the neighbor to the south, Alan Stanton. Stanton had a confrontation with the Ernie Clump group, I think.
Alan Stanton's family owns the property that was directly south of Jeff's farm. Like Jeff's land, Stanton's also abuts the Fulton State Game Area. Stanton and Jeff Titus were friendly with one another as far as being neighbors went, and they'd given one another permission to stray over onto the other's land while hunting. They'd also discussed that if either of them saw hunters trespassing on the other's property, they'd tell the trespassers they were on private property and that they needed to go. And on the morning of opening day in 1990, Stanton and Titus spotted a group of hunters on Stanton's land.
That year there was high water, and we were right out there at the edge of the field across from Burnsworth, but just a little bit south of it, in that one field that went all the way back to the marshy land. And I was right there when they shot it. I didn't see it, but they pulled up the shot and shot it. And they said, well, I don't think you guys have permission because right now you're on private property. And then they turned around, got their deer, and left.
Alan Stanton was interviewed about this incident both in 1990 and in 2000, and his memory of this event differs slightly from Jeff's memory of it now. Stanton confirmed to investigators that there had been 3 hunters who'd come onto his land on the morning of opening day and shot a deer in his swamp. But according to Stanton, it was he who had gone to confront the hunters, not Jeff Titus, though he said Titus had been there and witnessed the encounter. Anyway, when Stanton talked to these 3 hunters that morning and told them they were on private property, the hunters had told him that they'd spoken to a woman at the farmhouse and she had given them permission to hunt there. The woman they were describing was Stanton's mother. So, thinking that the 3 hunters had been told they could hunt on the land, Stanton let them be. Later that day, Alan Stanton had swung back by his house and mentioned the encounter to his mother. And Stanton's mother had told him that she didn't know what he was talking about. She hadn't given anyone permission to hunt on their land. Stanton told the cold case team he'd been very angry when he learned the hunters had been lying to him, and he went back into the woods to confront them.
Alan runs into him that night. You could hear him all the way up to my house yelling at him. I mean, he's screaming at him. Some of them said the guy had a beard, or, they say the guy had a beard or whatever. That was Alan Stanton yelling at people when he run into him. But Alan Stanton, when he got into it with somebody, you could hear him yelling all the way up to my house.
On Saturday, November 17th, Stan Driscoll drove down from Ann Arbor to meet up with Titus at his farm. The two of them didn't hunt that day there, though. Instead, they drove 27 miles north to Penfield Township.
Why did you decide to go there that day, on Saturday, and not stay at your property?
We hadn't got no deer at my place. We hadn't really even seen any. There was lots of shots, but there was no deer movement. So we hunted for 2 days and nothing, so I figured, well, I'm going up to Crandall's.
Jeff Titus had first met the Crandalls when he was in middle school, after he'd gotten a job working for them at their dairy farm. He'd grown up hunting their land, and he'd remained close to them after graduating high school and joining the Marines. Even after he bought his farm down in Fulton, and had his own land to hunt, Jeff would still spend some time of every deer hunting season hunting at the Crandall farm, as well as the neighboring farm owned by the Shepherd family. And that's where he and Stan decided to head to that Saturday, in the hopes their luck would be better there.
We headed out early. Like I said, we left my house. The wife and the kids were still sleeping. Then we take right off and go to Speed's, which is up in Verona. It's a restaurant. And then we eat there, then take off and go up to Crandall's. And we go back in behind Larry's house. I usually hunted off to the left-hand side next to Tom Warren's, and Stan would go all the way to the back next to Burbanks, I think it was, and hunted there all morning, and maybe went over to his dad's, and then that afternoon we went over to Shepherd's to finish out the evening.
Neither Titus nor Driscoll shot a deer that morning. For the evening hunt, they decided to head over to the Shepherd farm, which was just around the corner from the Crandalls. They'd had some coffee with Eloise and Gerald Shepherd, and talked about the big buck that Gerald had shot that morning. Then, at around 4 p.m., Stan and Jeff had gone out to the field so they could be in place before sunset, when they'd have the best chance of seeing a deer. It was there at the Shepherd farm, Jeff Titus says, that he shot his first deer that season.
Some hunters use slug buckshot. Me, I'm a slug hunter.
Okay.
Because I'm a good shot.
That's what we've heard, you're a good shot.
Well, the day those two guys got killed,
yep.
The deer I shot that night, I shot at 125 yards through the eye and out the top of the head,
wow.
Shooting up a hill. I did Shepherd's.
At the Shepherd's, right.
I can't help but think that Jeff bragging about how he shot this doe is such a very Jeff thing for him to do. Because by Jeff's own admission, he hadn't actually been aiming for this doe at all.
And this was the doe that I thought it was a buck I was shooting at. It was her head.
Wow.
He was standing next to her. I'd much rather have had the buck.
Regardless of whether it had been a crack shot or just a lucky one, Jeff Titus's claim that he shot this deer at the Shepherd farm that evening is an important part of this case. If Jeff Titus really did shoot that deer when and where he says he did, he's not guilty of murder. There was other evidence, too, to corroborate Jeff's story about the deer. The Shepherds themselves had told detectives back in 1990 that when Stan and Jeff had driven out of their farm that night, at around 6 p.m., they'd seen a deer in the back of Jeff's pickup. Stan can also confirm that Jeff got a deer while they were out hunting that day at the Shepherd farm. Well, Stan can sort of confirm it anyway.
Is all I do know is when we got there, there was a deer in the truck. Ergo, he'd gotten a deer somehow. So my inference is he shot a deer here.
Stan Driscoll has no specific recollection of whether or not he'd seen a deer in the back of Jeff's truck when they'd left the Shepherd farm that night. So while he can infer it would have been there, he can't say for certain that it was. But Stan remembers clearly there'd been a deer in Jeff's truck when they got back to his farm that night, and that's because of what happened next.
We went to Jeff Titus's property, drove into the back of the field because he had a deer that had not been at all gutted, And when we got into the field, there was this big glow. And we were driving toward it because we were very curious, and a policeman intercepted us and said, you can't go back there. I think he said there was some crime or something. I don't know exactly what he said.
Could you tell by the lights and the commotion that it was something serious?
Oh, he wouldn't let us get close enough. We were probably 300 yards from the location where this crime occurred. No, we could see nothing.
To Detective Bruce Wersima, who by then had arrived at the crime scene and been made the case's lead investigator, there had been nothing notable about Titus's encounter with the police that night.
This is the first contact law enforcement had with them when they arrived at the farm. They were requested to not let anybody on their land as the area was going to be cordoned off, and that they not come back into this particular area until after the investigation was over. Mr. Titus stated that it was very understandable and offered assistance in regard to the police, fire department, or whatever could use his property for purposes of driving back to the crime scene area. And he had no reason to be that cooperative as to allowing access to or through his property. I'd say he was accommodating.
Is it suspicious?
No, that part is not suspicious at all.
Other detectives with the Kalamazoo County Sheriff's Department remember events differently, though. As cold case detective Mike Brown described in the episode of Killer in Question about Jeff's case, Sergeant Marty Johnson, who is now Kalamazoo County's crime lab director, had known immediately something was wrong when he'd seen the headlights of Titus's truck approaching them that night through the fields.
The guy in charge of the evidence crime scene search, Lieutenant Marty Johnson, and he told me, he said, Mike, as soon as that guy drove up with that pickup truck, I told Bruce, there's your man. But Bruce didn't even go out there. He sent somebody else out there to talk to him.
Mike Workema, another cold case detective, was not involved in the original investigation back in 1990, and was not himself at the crime scene. But from his review of police reports from that night, he also believes that Titus's encounter with the police was significant.
Russ Richards, the police officer that stopped him there, he wrote a report that I confronted this person and we talked. And then he leaves, and then Russ says he came back, and I remember seeing him at the back there watching when we were doing stuff.
Detective Workema is correct that Deputy Russ Richards wrote a report in this encounter. But all the records we have make this encounter between Jeff Titus and the Kalamazoo County deputies seem very much more innocuous than how detectives Mike Brown and Mike Workema seem to describe it. And Russ Richards himself, who confronted Titus and Driscoll in the field, recalls it as nothing more than a routine encounter.
But the night before, were you there when the neighbor showed up, the one from the east side?
Yeah.
Did you talk to him?
Basically, he said he owned the property, and I said, well, hang on for just a second, and got a hold of the captain who referred him to, one of the captains or one of the detectives went over and talked with him, I'm not sure.
And although Detective Workema says that Titus was seen lurking about the crime scene that night, watching the investigators, there's absolutely nothing that documents that in any of the reports. And Russ Richards himself does not remember anything like that happening.
There's another reason, too, that the cold case team thought this first contact with Jeff Titus was important. Though it's not something they talk about much anymore. When they first started working on this case and honed in on Titus as their lead suspect, it was in part because of that short note in Russ Richards' logbook, where he documented his encounter with Stan Driscoll and Jeff Titus that night. The cold case team had this theory that when Jeff Titus had encountered Deputy Richards in the field, it hadn't been because of any activity he'd seen back there. Instead, they thought it had been because he was returning to the scene of his crime. But there was one member of the cold case team, Detective Rich Madison, who did not find this theory to be particularly convincing.
And the guy started talking about it, Mike Brown, Mike Workema, and they were running stuff about the lights. Well, we know that didn't happen. And I said, now wait a minute, it was just us. And I said, you know that can't be confirmed. And I said, you're lying to them and telling them that lights had definitely not been set up when we can't prove that one way or the other. And we got into, kind kind of a heated discussion.
By the time of Jeff Titus's trial, the prosecution seems to have abandoned this whole theory about the lights not being set up at the time that Jeff Titus went back there and saw Deputy Richards. Which, if I had to guess, is because they realized that Detective Madison was right. Or at least there's no way to prove he was wrong. Because the evidence shows Jeff Titus and Stan returned home to his farm that night a little after 7 p.m., maybe around 7:15 or so. By then, the police had already been there for an hour, and there's no evidence to suggest they'd been out there working in the dark that whole time.
While Detective Wiersema had not found Titus's interactions with the police that night to be particularly notable, he had very much considered Titus to be a suspect in his case. And then, 2 days later, when Jeff Titus was out in the game area and somehow found Doug Estes' missing shotgun, he became even more of a suspect.
It's not that we weren't suspicious of him to begin with. Sure. He lives close by. Proximity. He's an expert hunter. A little bit territorial, apparently. Yeah, it would all fit in that regard. But there's no evidence to really point to him. And with his alibi and polygraph, the alibi is the thing that I hinge my, I look at. Polygraph can go either way, never know.
The alibi that Wiersema's decision hinged on came from Eloise and Gerald Shepard. Titus told investigators that on the afternoon of the murders, he'd been hunting out at the Shepard farm. So on November 27th, 10 days after the murders, Ballot and Wiersema had gone up to Penfield Township to check out Titus's alibi.
What were the Shepards like? They were a local farm family?
Local farm family, older. At that time, they had to be in their 60s, possibly older. Welcomed us with open arms, had absolutely no problem answering any questions that we had. We felt good about the fact that Jeff had said he was here, and they were indicating that he was there, and Stan. We felt it unlikely that he would leave, even if he had an outside source, somebody he saw on the road go by and ask him, would you take me home? Anything like that. It's just a bit of a stretch, seems to me. If they thought he was involved in something, I believe wholeheartedly they would have told us.
And from what I've heard, they were sharp as tacks when they signed this. And
sharp, very sharp, yeah. I think she had just made some cookies and were offering them with coffee to us. And the mister the same. Just a nice, pleasant man.
So basically, you get this alibi and then you think, okay, but you still did, even though you had this rock-solid alibi, you still wanted to do a polygraph.
Because he's kind of an odd individual. And we're hearing different things of things that he's saying. So we want to try to clear it up, best of our ability.
Today, the cold case team criticizes Wiersema and Ballot for their decision to clear Jeff Titus as a suspect. In doing so, the cold case team says the original investigators had, quote, substituted a polygraph exam for a thorough investigation. But coming from the cold case team, this criticism brings to mind images of stones and glass houses, because the cold case team had been just as, if not more, reliant on polygraphs than the original investigators had been. There were a number of suspects in this case who were cleared by polygraph, even when they hadn't been able to come up with an alibi for the time of the murders. Take, for example, Skeeter Cerny, who had been hunting with Jem Bennett the morning before he was killed. Skeeter had been named a potential suspect early on by a number of people, along with another friend who'd been out hunting with him and Jim Bennett on that day.
And then to try to point the finger, kept coming over here trying to get something, and I talked to him, And then, like I said, finally he asked me to do a lie detector test, and I took the damn thing. I go, this stupid thing, why didn't you ask me before? I just took one before, but nobody asked. Just like Brent Birch, too. They finally made him take one, too.
Because of that Doe story.
Yeah, we both passed the damn. When I come out of there, he said, you flunked. I just laughed at him, going, yeah, right. He tried to, he was kind of a good guy anyhow.
Was he kidding, or was he?
Oh, yeah, he was kidding. I knew he was kidding.
Yeah. It wasn't just passing polygraphs that got suspects cleared in this case, though. Sometimes they didn't even need to go through with the formality of having taken and passed a polygraph, so long as they'd at least agree to take one. For instance, the cold case team seems to have cleared one witness in this case after he showed up for a polygraph exam. even though the polygraph wasn't actually completed. Because after starting the test, the examiner had deemed the witness to be too hungover for the test to work, so he called it off. But for someone who's going back now and trying to investigate this case from 30 years on, this extensive use of polygraphs by both the cold case team and the original investigators is kind of maddening. To make things worse, the vast majority of the records from these polygraph exams have been lost. There is not a single complete polygraph record that remains in the file today. And in many, or maybe even most cases, we don't even know what the date the polygraph was taken on, or even what questions were asked. A lot of the time, there's nothing more to document it than a brief line in a report somewhere that notes that a polygraph was given and passed. Which, for all the good that does me, might as well be a notation that the investigator had consulted a Ouija board and landed on the smiley face. And that's when there's any record at all that a polygraph was given. There are people in this case that I had thought were only ever considered witnesses, only to find out from them, when I showed up on their doorsteps, that they'd actually been suspects, and they'd been brought in for multiple polygraph exams before eventually being cleared. Anyway, the cold case team thinks that Jeff Titus is a sociopath, so the polygraph he passed doesn't matter. Something about how, if you don't have a conscience, then their magical Ouija board doesn't work on you, or something, and the results don't mean anything. But some members of the cold case team do think Titus's polygraph explains something else about this case. Something about the original investigators.
When he helped Bruce, they got Titus to take a polygraph, and Titus passed the polygraph he was given.
Yeah, I don't care about any of that.
No, that's what I'm saying. But what I'm trying to tell you is the reason that he's one of the three amigos. It's because a polygraph operator, they don't want to be beat by a double murderer. They don't want to be beat, and he was beat.
To Mike Brown, the reason that detectives Racema and Ballard have spent the better part of 2 decades advocating for Titus's innocence has nothing to do with the belief that an injustice was done. Mike Brown thinks it's really because they don't want to admit that Titus had outfoxed them on a polygraph. It's worth noting, though, that Jeff Titus wasn't actually given a polygraph because the original investigators wanted to find out if he was a murderer. By the time Titus took the polygraph exam, Ballard and Racema had largely ruled him out as a suspect already, based on the alibi. But they'd wanted him to come in for a polygraph because they'd had suspicions of a different sort. Not about the murders exactly, but more about what he'd done with the gun that he'd found.
So, is that it? He passed the polygraph. It can't be Jeff?
That's not the only reason that it can't be him. He passed the polygraph as to how, because all of these rumors were that he supposedly found a gun, cleaned it up, was going to use it, etc., then got panicky and called the police. That's what he indicated he would take the polygraph test on, his truthfulness regarding this. It's not just the polygraph, it's the entire investigation with Jeff's own statement as to what he had done, with the Shepherd's statement that he was there that afternoon at 4 o'clock and drove out of the driveway, which they saw him do around 6 with a deer in the back.
The Shepherds had been able to place Jeff Titus at their farm at 4 p.m. on the day of the murders, and could place him there once again at 6 p.m. But to know whether this is truly an alibi, we need something to compare it against. We need to know when the murders happened, and how the cold case team thinks that Jeff Titus committed the crime. Although we have spoken to Detective Mike Brown, we have not been able to speak to either Detective Mike Werkema, the other lead cold case detective, or Prosecutor Stu Fenton, who served as the prosecutor that advised the cold case team. However, Fenton and Werkema were both interviewed for the Killer in Question Discovery ID episode on Jeff Titus's case. Because this is their theory about Jeff Titus's guilt and how he did the crime, we think it's important to hear from them in their own words about what they think happened. And while Werkema and Fenton agree that Titus was in fact at the Shepherd farm on the afternoon of November 17th, they believe that the one-page statement from the Shepherds, the one that confirms Jeff Titus's alibi, is about as worthless as the piece of paper that it's written on.
You look at this investigation, you got a little paragraph, and it's supposed to be an alibi witness. How much content, detail went into this interview? I don't need to say anything more about it. He parked his car, they went hunting. That was the extent of it. The Shepherds couldn't tell you where Jeff was.
Eloise and Gerald Shepherd were not the only alibi witnesses in this case, though. There was someone else who'd been with Jeff Titus that day, his hunting companion, Stan Driscoll.
When I found out that the cold case team was investigating Jeff, I was baffled. I could not understand why they would be heavily investigating him. Because, one, they had this evidence from the shepherds that he couldn't have done it, and I knew he was with me all that day, and it made no sense to me for the police to investigate him.
Stan Driscoll had believed himself to be proof of Jeff Titus's innocence. He knew he'd been with Jeff that entire day, from before dawn until after dark, and therefore he knew that Jeff could not have done the murders. Detective Workema and Prosecutor Fenton have a different take, though.
What do you mean he was here all day? Were you with him? Were you out in the woods hunting with him personally? He wasn't with him 24/7.
If you're not with the bad guy and he's out doing his stuff, you don't know what he did, so you can't tell us what he did because you don't know. Yes, you were hunting with him, but you weren't with him.
Alibi had holes in it. It was not airtight. It was Swiss cheese. He had plenty of time to leave, come back, and kill these victims, which is exactly what happened.
From the cold case team's point of view, Stan Driscoll was not an alibi witness at all. He's actually confirmation that Jeff Titus does not have an alibi for the critical window of time during which the murders had occurred. Though the exact time is disputed, Jim Bennett and Doug Estes must have been shot somewhere between around 4 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. that afternoon. And Stan Driscoll and Jeff Titus had split up to go hunt in the Shepherd's Fields a bit after 4 p.m. that day, after speaking to the Shepherds. They'd been separated from then until the end of legal hunting hours, which on that day would have been about 5:45 p.m. That means during the window of time that matters, there's no one who had direct eyes on Jeff Titus. According to the cold case team, this gave Jeff just enough time to commit the murders. Their theory is that after Driscoll goes out to his blind that afternoon, he assumes that Titus is doing the same. But Jeff doesn't. Unbeknownst to Stan, Jeff Titus is being consumed by a fear that someone might be trespassing on his property back in Fulton. And so he needs to get back and make sure there's no one there. Their theory is, instead of going out to hunt, Jeff Titus snuck back to the farmhouse, climbed into his truck, and drove 40 minutes to get home.
So he's got this obsession. Why would this day be any different? His thought is, I gotta go back and check my farm again. And then that's what he does. He drives back to his farm, and Titus comes in and sees this guy in his property. Maybe he went to thinking, you know what, someone's on my property this time, I'm gonna kill him. That could have been his thought. I'm not sure.
Detective Workema believes that Titus may have actually been sneaking home that day with the intention of committing a murder, or rather with the hope of committing a murder, since Jeff Titus had no way of knowing if there was going to be anywhere there for him to kill. But Workema believes that Titus gets lucky. When he pulls up at his farm, he sees Doug Estes, who has killed a deer on Jeff's property. Jeff confronts him, and Doug Estes argues back. And then things get heated.
Now he's got to disarm Estes, and he's got him at gunpoint. Poor Bennett, wrong place at the right time, sees what's going on, and that could have been the spark to cause, well, Titus, I got to do something quick now. Boom. Being the marksman he is, right in the deer tag, we're back. Bennett turns to run, boom, same.
The cold case team believes that after he kills Doug Estes for trespassing on his land and then kills Jim Bennett to cover up his crime, Jeff takes the deer that Doug Estes shot and loads it up onto his own truck. Then they believe he drove back 27 miles to the Shepherd farm, parked his truck behind their farmhouse with the deer still in it, and then when Stan came back to the farmhouse at dark, Jeff Titus pretended like he had been there the whole time.
When the cold case team began their work in this case, they quickly focused on Titus. His alibi from the Shepherds was irrelevant, because it didn't cover the period of time that matters. But what the cold case team didn't know is that there was anyone else who might have actually seen Titus during this window.
Yeah. Nobody, until me, nobody went over and sat Driscoll down and talked to him.
I know.
And I called him and talked to him on the phone a couple of times, told him I'd like to come over and interview him.
When cold case detective Rich Madison interviewed Stan Driscoll in April of 2000, it was the first time that Driscoll had ever given a statement to investigators. And Driscoll told Madison that yes, he and Titus had been hunting together out at the Crandall and Shepherd farms on the day of the murders. And he also explained to Detective Madison why he and Titus had encountered the police that night.
What he shed the light on was these guys were saying, well, he said that they went back there to check his fox traps. I went back there to clean a deer, what Titus said. And I said, Stan, I said, what drew you back there? And he said, the lights. And Titus's wife confirmed that.
Driscoll both confirmed Titus's alibi and disproved the cold case team's theory about Titus trying to return to the scene of the crime. But as Detective Workema and Prosecutor Fenton see it, the fact that this was the first time that Driscoll was ever interviewed was yet another indication that the original investigators had failed to adequately investigate the case.
How big of a mistake do you think it was that they didn't interview Stan at the time?
Huge. It's basic 101. You interview any potential witness.
Workema and Fenton are not wrong here. Interviewing Stan Driscoll would have been the investigation 101 thing to do. Detective Bruce Rorsema doesn't disagree with them in this either.
I did not talk to Stan, nor did Roy Ballett initially. I wish I had now. Like I say, it would have taken the cloud off if I had. And I regret not doing it as soon as possible. But as I say, we were moving along. The only possibility I see with interviewing Stan right away would have probably exonerated Titus a lot more solid. And I regret that.
The investigation that Detective Rorsema was doing back in 1990 was in many ways a triage situation. For reasons that to this day he still doesn't understand, Rorsema was the only detective that the captain assigned to the case. And having spent a couple of months now in Kalamazoo myself, retracing many of Rorsema's steps and re-interviewing his witnesses, there are parts of the investigation I can point to now with the benefit of hindsight and say, yeah, that was a mistake. But I also have a deep appreciation for the immenseness of the task that was before him back in 1990. For Rorsema to have followed up on all of his ruled-out leads by exhausting all potential sources of further evidence, well, that was not something that Rorsema could have made a reality. Not with the resources that he had. And besides, I have no idea why Stu Fenton and Mike Workema would want to complain about the original detective's failure to interview Stan Driscoll back in 1990. Because arguably, that failure is the thing that made it possible for them to win a conviction against Jeff Titus 12 years later.
This is the peculiar part of this story. I was expected to remember minute events that happened time and time again on a particular day that happened 10 years ago. And since it was a very typical day 10 years ago, there's no reason I would particularly hold that day out and keep it unique in my mind, because it was not unique in my mind. It was a typical hunting day with Jeff Titus.
By the time he was interviewed in 2000, what Stan still remembered about that typical day had mostly been the parts of it that happened after they'd gotten back to Titus's farm that night, not the parts that had happened before.
I personally perceive it like, if you're driving down the highway, you can see a car accident, and you sort of look out and then you go on. But you don't really remember what you did the rest of the day when you saw that car accident. This is exactly what happened to me that day.
Stan Driscoll remembered distinctly the parts of the day that had been the equivalent of driving past a car wreck. But other parts of the day made less of an impression on him. By 2000, his memory was more of an indistinct impression than a specific recollection. And Stan Driscoll is the kind of guy who tends to be very precise about which kind of memories are which.
The pattern we always followed was we would go to one place in the morning, and in this case we went to Shepherd's in the afternoon and Crandall's in the morning, which was not what we always did, but very commonly that's what we did.
And there was nothing unusual about the day that would...
Nothing whatsoever, except at the end of the day there was this murder. But that was simply an extraneous thing. It had nothing to do with the day whatsoever.
When talking about Stan's testimony at trial and the alibi that the jury had rejected, Jeff Titus's frustration sometimes comes through.
If he'd have given a statement back then, I don't think I'd be arrested because everything would have been fresh in his head. As it was 10 years later, well, he's got to think back, this is what we normally did. And when he says this is what we normally did, that don't mean nothing. He should have given a statement right there at that time.
But even though Stan's memory had gotten fuzzy in parts by the time he was interviewed in 2000, Detective Madison had found him to be credible. Stan's statement was one of the reasons that Detective Madison became convinced that Jeff Titus was not a viable suspect. The rest of the cold case team, though, had not agreed with Detective Madison. And after a time, Madison's dissent in this point had begun to undermine the team's ability to function effectively.
But I got thrown off the case because I wouldn't believe it. I thought there was too much other information. It didn't make sense to me, and I wasn't quiet about it. I don't want to send an innocent man to prison. And I thought it was just a bunch of malarkey. There was too much over here to suggest another possibility.
According to Detective Mike Brown, the problem with Rich Madison had not been that he was a dissenting voice. Dissent was fine, encouraged even. The problem with Rich Madison was that he'd fallen for a bogus story.
Rich was defeated by Driscoll. Rich was assigned to go to Lansing and meet with Driscoll to interview him. Now, this guy is supposedly a professor and a world traveler and all that. Rich stands outside his apartment door, and the guy opens the door and said, "Would you please take your shoes off?" Rich takes his shoes off. I looked at Rich when he said that, and I said, he had you right there. He had you. You were under his control at that point. Once you took your shoes off, he blustered the hell out of all his travels and everything else. And Titus was with me all day long. And so Rich was defeated that first day. First day.
It's true that Detective Madison found Stan Driscoll to be a credible witness. That's kind of an odd criticism for Mike Brown to be raising, though, because the cold case team also believed Stan Driscoll, as did the prosecutor at Titus's trial. They just didn't think that Stan provided Titus with an alibi. And Madison had come to believe Titus was innocent not just because he'd believed Stan Driscoll. For Madison, the real problem with the cold case team's theories about Titus is that they seem to be heavy on conjecture and light on evidence.
The question is, would he have left the Shepherd house to drive 27 miles to his house to check the property? Now, this guy lived to hunt and trap. Now, he's going to interrupt a hunt to drive all the way down there. And there's even some wild opinions from other guys on the team that where he got the deer is that he stole it. One of these guys had shot it. He carried it out, threw it in his truck, and took it back up there and claimed it.
What do you think of that theory?
I think it's horseshit, to be blunt. And there's nothing to back it up.
The cold case team's theory that Jeff Titus stole a deer from Doug Estes is based on the fact that Jeff Titus did in fact return to his farm with a deer that night. A deer that, according to Driscoll, Titus acquired sometime between 4 p.m. and about 5:45 p.m., when Driscoll thought Titus was hunting at the Shepherd farm. But the cold case team also believes that Titus spent that time that he was out of sight by driving to his farm and back to commit the murders, which leaves basically no time for Titus to have also successfully gone hunting and killed a deer. The problems with this timeline become more manageable, though, if you assume Titus did not kill the deer himself, but rather that he stole the deer while he was committing the murders. Not all the members of the cold case team are so gung-ho about this whole deer theory, though. Detective Mike Brown is a bit more flexible in his commitment to the deer theory. Because, see, there's really a big problem with this idea that Jeff Titus stole a deer that Doug Estes had killed.
Well, you mentioned earlier that you think Doug Estes shot a deer, but people only heard 2 shots. People only heard 2 shots that afternoon.
See, that's just a speculation on my part.
All of the hunters in the Fulton State game area that afternoon reported hearing 2 shots, and only 2 shots, all afternoon, sometime not long before sunset. And since 2 shots were needed to kill both Jim Bennett and Doug Estes, there are not shots left over for anyone to kill a deer. But somewhere, somehow, Jeff Titus did acquire a deer that day. That much Stan Driscoll is certain of.
The only thing I remember about that, as I said, I don't remember him even putting it in the truck. I know he had one in the truck. When we got to this field at his place where we gutted it.
This memory that Stan has, though, about gutting the deer that night, well, if you're a deer hunter, you're probably already wondering right now what the heck is going on. He says he shot the deer in Battle Creek at the Shepherd Farm, but he didn't field dress it. He just put it back in the truck, and they brought it back to his farm to clean and do whatever. And so does that sound weird to you?
That doesn't ring true at all. What'd Jeff say?
He said he didn't do it. Like he didn't field dress it, yeah. I mean, the deer was not field dressed, but does that sound weird to you, though, that he didn't field dress it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah. So I think...
That's unusual?
That is extremely unusual that he did not
Field dress it.
Field dress that deer. Gut it out. You know, you just slide it and you put the insides out.
This non-gutted deer that Titus brought back to his farm that evening, it's kind of weird, yeah. But it also doesn't really get any less weird by adding a couple murders to the scenario. Either way, Titus still has a deer that's not been field dressed for some reason or another. And Jeff Titus agrees that it was unusual for him not to have field dressed a deer, in the sense that it wasn't his usual practice. But he also says it wasn't strange.
No, some people say, if you transport a deer without field dressing it, you're going to ruin it. It ruins the meat.
I've had many a person ask Locker Plants how many deer come in with the stuff still in them, that people never dress them out. Like I say, I just figured it was dark, wanted to get home, loaded it in the truck, took it back home, figured I'd dress it out in the middle of the field and use it as an attractant for fox. And then set my scent post sets off to the side. I mean, they wouldn't be right on it, but they'd be over. And I'd have my urine posts, because it'd be like tree roots, and I'd burn them so that they were black. They stand right out in the dark. And animals would walk right over there, take a leak on it, and I'd catch them in a trap.
If Titus had been using the deer guts to bait his traps, that would be a crime. You can't do that. On the other hand, if you shoot a deer and you just happen to field dress it in the general area that your traps are at, and in doing so, you just happen to leave behind a tasty gut pile that foxes are going to go check out, well, that's fine. That's legal. You're allowed to do that. Detective Mike Brown, though, is not convinced by Titus's explanation about why he kept the guts in the deer that night before returning home.
He never left guts in a deer. He always gutted it where he got it, where he found it. That just made the load lighter.
But carrying the guts back is going to be pretty gross. Like, I kind of get that.
Hunters carry all kinds of shit with them. They have buckets and they have tarps and they carry all kinds of stuff.
All right, so why didn't he gut it if he stole it from Doug Estes?
I don't know. I think he didn't gut it because he was running around like a chicken with his head cut off.
Detective Mike Brown's theory is that Titus simply never had the time to field dress the doe that he stole. He was on the clock, and if he's going by the cold case team's timeline of how the murders were committed, then every minute is precious. He couldn't have simply left the deer where it was, though, because according to the cold case team, Doug Estes had shot this hypothetical deer on Titus's property. Its presence would implicate him in the murders, so he has to move it somewhere. But why not just drag it to his barn instead of his truck and hang it up there? Or if he can't do that because he's afraid that Stan will later find this ungutted deer and think it's suspicious, then why not load it onto his truck and then on his way back to the shepherd's farm, stop on the side of the road and roll it out to the roadside? It just looked like roadkill then. No one would look twice at it. Or if somehow someone did look twice and noticed that apparently this roadkill deer had actually been shot, there's no one who's going to somehow connect it to a double homicide 20 miles away. It would have been assumed that it had been poached or something by someone unable to recover it. For the cold case team, though, this is where their theories about Titus's obsessions can again help fill in the gaps in their case. Because they can argue, Titus had been too obsessed with his property and the deer on it to give up a deer that had been shot there, even when keeping the deer would implicate him in a murder. It's worth pointing out that in some ways this whole question of Jeff's alibi is flipping the burden of proof on its head. The cold case team isn't arguing here that they had evidence that shows Titus really did leave the Shepherd farm and drive back to Fulton. Because when they arrested Titus, they didn't have any evidence to show that. Instead, what the cold case team is arguing is that Jeff is unable to prove conclusively that, as a matter of physical impossibility, he could not have done the crime.
Well, I was just asking why do you think he went home after getting out in the woods?
If I didn't think he'd have went home, he wouldn't be in prison.
Fair enough.
Why would I put his ass in prison if I knew he was out there in Battle Creek?
The evidence that Jeff did not remain at the Shepherd farm to hunt that afternoon and instead secretly drove to his farmhouse and then back again is not really evidence so much as it is tautology. The prosecution in this case believed that Titus committed the murders, and in order to have committed the murders, Jeff Titus necessarily had to have been there at the scene of the crime. Therefore, since Jeff committed the murders, he must have driven back to Fulton to get there. But to original investigator Roy Ballett, who is himself a hunter and familiar with how hunters operate, this interpretation of the alibi evidence is nonsensical.
Just because you can't see a person that's in the woods with you doesn't mean that they're gone. And anybody with a lick of common sense is certainly going to take that into consideration, because you're going to be far enough apart that you don't want to see each other in case there's a deer that comes between or whatever.
Yes, Detective Ballett acknowledges there was at least a window of time between a little after 4 p.m. and a little before dark when Jeff Titus hadn't been seen by anyone. And that gave the prosecution the room it needed to argue that Jeff had in fact returned to Fulton. But there was no affirmative evidence to show that's what actually did happen. Shortly before Jeff's trial, though, that would change. The cold case team revisited an old witness, and they found something new.
So I'll give you an hour 30. How's that? There's an hour 30. No one had eyes on Jeff.
Probably not. They didn't have any eyes on him.
Is that an aha moment for the cold case team? Is that the little piece of information they need to get Jeff to the scene?
The aha moment for the cold case team was when Bonnie Huffman changed her statement. That's an aha moment, because now we have an eyewitness that places Jeff Titus in the immediate vicinity and time frame of the shooting. That's an aha moment.
Next time on Undisclosed.
That's all for episode 5 of Undisclosed, The State vs. Jeff Titus. There's no addendum episode this week, but we'll be back next Monday with episode 6. Amith Telhan is our executive producer. Our logo was designed by Baluki, and our theme music is by Ramiro Marquez. Audio production was done by Rebecca Lavoie of Partisan Crime Media and host of the Crime Writers On podcast. And music from this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. Transcripts for episodes are available on our website at undisclosed-podcast.com. They're brought to you by our amazing transcript team, Dom Logus, Britta Bliss, Skylar Park, and Eric Fladell. And of course, thank you to our sponsors for making it possible for us to come back week after week. You can follow us online, and on all social media, our handle is @UndisclosedPod. We're at Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if any of our listeners out there have information on Jeff Titus' case that they'd like to share, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at undisclosedpodcast@gmail.com, or you can call and leave a message at 410-205-5563. That's all for this week, and thanks so much for listening.